Hey guys, Blake Watley here. Today I was going to do a video on all the types of line that are available on the market today and try to help you as a beginning angler or novice angler choose the right type of line that you need to get started, depending on the application or just in general what you need. There's basically three types of fishing line on the market today. You've got the old original monofilament that grandpa or dad was using, and you've got braided line, and then you've got fluorocarbon. I'll talk about each one in depth, talk about the qualities, the strengths and weaknesses of each line, and try to help you make a decision on what you need to get started. Alright guys, the first one I want to talk about is nylon monofilament. This is the old original. It's been around forever. This is just an example Berkeley Trilane big game. You can find this almost anywhere. The thing about monofilament, the qualities are, first and foremost, price. It'll be the cheapest of all three lines. You'll be able to get a lot more yardage of line for a lot less money. Another quality of monofilament, abrasion resistance, low memory, and it floats. Those are the big differences with monofilament. When I say memory, the line is normally pretty soft and supple. It'll not store memory as it's on the spool. A lot of times line has a tendency to stay in that curled formation, and you'll notice that with fluorocarbons a lot more than monofilament, and that hinders your ability to cast the line smoothly and for it to come off the reel in a smooth fashion. Abrasion resistance, monofilament is pretty good. Depends on obviously the brand and the type. They're not all built the same. And then probably the biggest part of monofilament quality that keeps it in the game with today's more advanced anglers is that it floats. That makes it exceptionally well for top water lures. Fluorocarbon, which has become all the rage, is unusable for a top water because the line sinks and it affects the way the bait reacts in the water and pulls it down. You just can't use it. Monofilament is great for top water lures, whether it be walking baits, chuggers or pluggers or anything like that, poppers. The one downside to monofilament versus the others is sensitivity, and that's why monofilament has lost a lot of its market share in the last 10 years to fluorocarbon. As fluorocarbon has become more affordable, the difference between feel with monofilament versus fluorocarbon or braid is daylight and dark. If you're fishing a technique like a Texas rig or a jig, Carolina rig, anything where you're feeling, it's not a moving bait technique and the fish are striking and more or less hooking itself. If it's a feel technique where you're trying to feel that bite, monofilament just can't compare with fluorocarbon or braid. But can you use monofilament? Well, absolutely. They were catching plenty of fish in the 60s and the 70s and the 80s and the early 90s without fluorocarbon or braid on monofilament. Lots of big fish and lots of limits caught on monofilament. Monofilament as a beginning angler would probably be my suggestion for you to start with. It's very affordable, it casts very well, and you can learn on it. I learned on it. My brother learned on it. Everybody I know that's my age at fishing learned on monofilament because that's all we had. But just for the purchasing price of it and its casting ability and how smooth and workable monofilament is, it's probably your best bet as a beginner. So, what type of techniques work well for monofilament? As I said before, top water, obviously. And what I still use monofilament for a lot today is really any kind of moving bait. Spinner baits, rattle traps, certain crankbaits, I'll still use monofilament for. One other quality that monofilament has over the others is, sometimes it's a good thing, sometimes it's a bad thing, but I feel like for treble hooked baits, monofilament has a lot of stretch. The line, when you set the hook, has a lot of pull and stretch to it, and that stretch stays there. Most of the time you need a little bit stiffer rod to get a good hook set with monofilament, but I still use monofilament today on a lot of moving baits and exclusively on my top waters. All right, the next line I want to talk about is braided line. Um, this is exactly what it sounds like. It's fibers that are braided together to make a super strong, super tough line. Qualities of braid right off the bat, probably number one is strength. Braid, the strength of braid for the diameter of the line is going to be much higher. What is this? This is 65-pound test, and it has the diameter of 16-pound, say, monofilament. Braid for you as a beginner is going to seem, especially if you have like 40, 50, 65-pound braid, it's going to seem almost unbreakable compared to monofilament or fluorocarbon. Um, Another quality of braid is very little to zero stretch. When you pull braid, there's no stretch in that line hardly. If you move your rod tip 6 inches, you just move that hook 6 inches. So on hook setting techniques like a Texas rig or a jig or something like that, very good for setting the hook, especially if you don't have a very strong hook set. One downside to braid, visibility, obviously. This is a moss green color. Braid comes in almost any color under the sun, but a lot of people have confidence problems with it in clear water and believe it reduces the amount of strikes you could get. Obviously, I wouldn't be using braid if I could see 10 foot down, not as my main line all the way to the lure. But personally, if I'm fishing anything that's slightly stained, a foot and a half to 2 foot or less visibility, all the way up to obviously muddy, I don't have a problem fishing braid as my main line. I don't think it costs me any strikes in muddy to stained water, or if I'm fishing heavy cover into grass or into bushes, lay downs, stuff like that. So what techniques would I use braid for? Well, for me, obviously, like I said before, if I'm fishing heavy cover, if I'm fishing into grass, if I'm fishing into bushes, wood lay downs, if I'm having to pull fish through obstacles, braid is my number one choice. And the thing that braid really probably changed the game more than anything on is top water heavy cover. And when I say that, I'm just about exclusively talking about frog fishing, hollow body frogs or soft plastic frogs. I can't even imagine throwing a frog on monofilament and trying to pull a fish out of the areas that I would fish that frog. It'd be just incredibly heartbreaking if I tried to do that. I can only imagine the amount of fish I'd lose compared to braid. Those are the areas and the techniques that I would use braid for. Okay, so the last line type I wanted to talk about is fluorocarbon. Fluorocarbon, looking at it with the naked eye, is fairly indiscernible from monofilament, but that's where the likenesses stop. It is a completely different type of line. The biggest qualities of fluorocarbon that the companies pushed early on when they released it was visibility. Fluorocarbon does not refract light once it is a little ways underwater. I mean, you can look at the different manufacturers and what they say, but basically it's invisible to fish under the water. Another quality or advantage of fluorocarbon is low stretch. Not as low as braided line, but compared to monofilament, very, very low. Fluorocarbon will still stretch a little, but not much. So it's very good on those hook setting techniques that I described, like Texas rigging or jigs, stuff like that. The other big advantage of fluorocarbon, obviously, is sensitivity. It's not as sensitive as braid. Braid is the most sensitive of the three, but fluorocarbon is light years ahead of monofilament. Very different when you're fishing this fluorocarbon line as far as what you can feel in the rod. So, what techniques would I use with fluorocarbon line? Basically, like I said, any of those hook setting techniques, anything where I'm feeling and having to set the hook, like with a jig or a Texas rig, Carolina rig. Also, I will crank with fluorocarbon line. I'll use fluorocarbon line sometimes with my moving baits, even though I also use monofilament. Really just depends on the scenario and what the cover and what the depth range I'm trying to fish is. If I'm fishing deep crankbaits, fluorocarbon is going to get you a little bit more depth on your deep crankbaits than mono. I can throw 12-pound fluorocarbon versus 12-pound mono on, say, a DD22 or some deep diving plug, and I would probably get another 2 foot out of the fluorocarbon versus the mono, maybe more. Those are definitely the advantages of fluorocarbon line. The one no-no with fluorocarbon line, that is the one technique that you absolutely can't do with it, is top water, open water top water, especially like poppers, walkers. You don't want to use fluorocarbon line for that. So just an overview, going back over once more, as a beginning angler, like I said earlier in the video, I think you'd be best served starting out and learning with monofilament line, especially if you're on a budget. You're going to get a lot more line for a lot less money. There's not any technique that you can't do with monofilament. It's going to be much easier to manage that line, cast that line if you're using a bait caster. Just in general, it's a great line to start out with, especially considering there's going to be some backlashes, there's going to be some mistakes throwing lures in trees and everything else, until you become a lot more skillful with your setup. I would definitely try using the monofilament to start out with. Only other one that I would consider, depending on where I lived at, if I knew I was fishing basically a river type situation or just muddy water all the time, there wasn't any chance of me doing anything else, I might would use or start with Braid. It's pretty manageable and it is a lot more expensive, but the thing about Braid is you're going to get a lot more life out of it. I've had Braid on reels for 2 seasons, maybe even more. I hate to say that, but it'll last that long. Now, it may lose color and it may not be green or whatever color that you bought the original Braid with, but its longevity is unquestionably the best of the 3. Alright guys, this is just a quick tip I wanted to give you on braided line. If you can see, this is some brand new Power Pro braided line, moss green. It's very dark, pretty on the spool. It's what it looks like. When you fish with this line for a little while, it's going to start losing its color. You're going to see green on your thumbs, and the line's going to start to look lighter like that, what this line looks like on this reel. If that gives you a problem, there's a couple of things you can do. If you're fishing in grass and you're worried about that line being too bright and being seen, you can mark the end of that line next to your lure with like a black Sharpie marker and darken it up. But one thing you can do too, and what I normally do, because I try to get maximum use out of my equipment or my gear, is this line has probably been on this reel for, I don't know, 2 seasons. What I will do is spool this line off and get it back on basically backwards. You can do that a couple of different ways. Sometimes I'll spool reel to reel. So I'll take this line and start spooling it onto another reel with this spool in free spool and kind of tighten down the spool tensioning knob. So this line on the outside that's lost its color will be on the bottom of the next spool, and when you get this peeled off, all that line down there next to the spool that you haven't ever used, it's going to be pretty dark green and look completely unused, because it is. Another way you can do that, if you don't want to go reel to reel, is obviously you can try to peel it off all by hand, but it might get tangled up. So a safe way to do it is go and tie that line off to, say, like the antenna on your truck, and walk that line out all the way out, however many feet of line you have on the reel. Come to the end, set that down or break your knot loose, and then go back and tie in the outside line that's tied at your antenna and spool that line up, and you'll have that nice, clean, unused line that was at the bottom of your spool. That's a tip I do with all my braid. I never take off a spool of braid without using pretty much both ends of that braid and wear it down.